They called her the Silent Queen, the woman who bled in shadows while her king bathed in glory. For 7 years, Lyra Vale stood beside Alpha King Kaelin Draven, deflecting knives meant for his back, crushing rebellions before they reached his ears, protecting an empire that never even knew her name. But loyalty has a breaking point. And when the most powerful man in the Crescent Moon Empire finally looked up from his throne to find her, she was already gone. This is the story of the woman who disappeared, and the king who never realized he'd already lost everything. Stick around until the end, hit that like button, and drop your city in the comments so I know where my pack is watching from. My. The grand hall of the Moonstone Palace reeked of roasted meat, spilled wine, and the particular brand of arrogance that only came with absolute power. Kaelin Draven sat at the head of the longest table in the empire, his massive frame draped in black furs lined with silver thread, his jaw set like carved granite as nobles and warlords competed for his attention. He didn't smile. He rarely did. The Alpha King had no need for pleasantries when fear did the work for him. Lyra Vale sat 3 seats to his right, not beside him, not across from him. 3 seats away, positioned just close enough to be acknowledged as his mate, just far enough to be forgotten. She wore midnight blue tonight, a gown that hugged her frame without demanding attention, her silver blonde hair twisted into a braid that fell down her spine, her hands rested folded in her lap. Her posture was perfect. Her expression, as always, gave away nothing. Across the table, Lady Seraphine Karen leaned forward, her red lips curving into a smile sharp enough to cut glass. The woman was beautiful in the way a viper was beautiful, sleek, dangerous, and fully aware of her own venom. Lady Seraphine's fingers brushed Kaelin's wrist as she spoke, her voice dripping honey and ambition. Your Majesty, I must say, the Eastern expansion has been nothing short of brilliant. Your strategic mind is unmatched. Kaelin's dark eyes flickered with interest. The Eastern territories fell because they were weak. Weakness invites conquest. Lyra said nothing. She lifted her wine glass, took a measured sip, and set it back down without a sound. Seraphine's gaze slid toward her for half a heartbeat before returning to Kaelin. Of course, strength recognizes strength. It's why your reign has been so enduring. The word hung in the air like smoke. Lord Brennan, a warlord from the northern clans, cleared his throat and raised his goblet. To the Alpha King, may his empire stretch from coast to coast, and may his bloodline carry forward with the strength it deserves. The toast rippled down the table. Glasses lifted. Voices echoed the sentiment. Kaelin inclined his head, accepting the praise as if it were oxygen. Lyra's fingers tightened imperceptibly around the stem of her glass. Seraphine's smile widened. Speaking of bloodlines, Your Majesty, the Council has been wondering, when might we expect an heir? Surely the Empire deserves a prince to carry forward your legacy. The hall quieted. Kaelin's expression didn't shift, but something colder settled into the air around him. When the time is right, the Empire will have its heir. Seraphine tilted her head, her tone sweet as poison. Of course, though one does wonder if perhaps the right foundation has been laid. After all, a king must ensure his mate is strong enough to bear the future of his bloodline. Lyra's pulse didn't quicken, her breathing didn't change. She had learned long ago how to turn herself into stone. But inside, something cracked. Kaelin said nothing. He didn't defend her, didn't correct Seraphine's veiled insult, didn't even glance in Lyra's direction. He simply took a drink and turned the conversation toward trade routes. Lyra set her glass down with the kind of precision that came from years of practice. She rose from her seat, her movements fluid and unhurried. No one looked at her. She walked the length of the hall, her footsteps silent against marble floors, and slipped through the arched doorway into the cold night beyond. The winter air bit into her skin, sharp and clean and merciless. She welcomed it. Better the cold than the suffocating heat of a room that refused to see her. Lyra descended the palace steps and moved through the courtyard gardens, her breath misting in the moonlight. Her mind was not racing. It was eerily, dangerously calm. 7 years. 7 years of standing beside a man who saw her as furniture, who took her loyalty for granted the way one took air for granted, essential, invisible, and easily ignored. She had crushed 3 assassination attempts in the last year alone. She had identified the Valen cartel's infiltration into the Royal Guard before Kaelin even knew there was a threat. She had negotiated the Southern alliance that prevented a civil war, all while he sat in council meetings debating which vineyards produced the best wine. And tonight, in front of the entire court, he had let Seraphine Caron question her worth. He had let them all question her worth. Lyra stopped beneath the skeletal branches of an old oak tree, her fingers brushing the rough bark. She closed her eyes and let herself feel it, the exhaustion, the rage, the grief she had been swallowing for years. Then she opened her eyes, and the decision was already made. She didn't return to the banquet hall. She walked to her private chambers, a wing of the palace few even knew existed, and began to pack. Not everything, just the essentials. A cloak, a blade. Documents she had spent years compiling, names, alliances, secrets that could topple kingdoms if placed in the wrong hands. She left behind the gowns, the jewelry, the carefully curated life of a queen who was never truly seen. By the time the first light of dawn touched the horizon, Lyra Vale was gone. Kaelin didn't notice her absence until midday. He was in the war room, reviewing maps of the Western Territories with his general, Orin Thrace, when he offhandedly asked where Lyra was. Orin blinked. "I haven't seen her, Your Majesty." Kaelin frowned. "Find her." It took 3 hours. 3 hours for his guards to search the palace, the grounds, the surrounding woods. 3 hours before Captain Darius Vane, his second-in-command, stood before him with a face carved from unease. "She's gone, Your Majesty." Kaelin's eyes narrowed. "Gone where?" Darius hesitated. "We don't know. Her chambers are empty. No guards reported seeing her leave. It's as if she vanished." Kaelin's jaw tightened. "She didn't vanish. Find her." Darius nodded and left. Kaelin stood alone in the war room, staring at the maps spread before him, and felt the first flicker of something unfamiliar. Unease. He dismissed it. Lyra had retreated before. She would return. She always did. 1 week passed. Then 2. Lyra did not return. And slowly, methodically, the empire began to fracture. It started small. A trade shipment from the southern provinces disappeared. Then another. Then a third. Kaelin summoned the Minister of Commerce, a wiry man named Corvin, who had always been efficient to the point of invisible. Corvin wrung his hands, his voice tight with panic. "Your Majesty, I don't understand. These routes have been secure for years. The agreements were ironclad. Who negotiated them?" Kaelin asked, his tone flat. Corvin's face went pale. The Queen, Your Majesty." "She handled the southern alliances personally." Kaelin said nothing. 2 days later, the eastern border erupted into violence. A rival alpha named Matthias Kane launched a coordinated assault on 3 key outposts, claiming Kaelin had violated territorial agreements. Kaelin called an emergency council. "What agreements?" he demanded. Silence. Finally, Lord Brennan spoke, his voice careful. "Your Majesty, Queen Lyra mediated the Eastern treaties. She met with Kane directly last year and brokered a truce. If she's no longer here to reinforce those terms," Kaelin's fist slammed against the table, "I don't need her to reinforce anything. I am the Alpha King." Brennan lowered his gaze. "Of course, Your Majesty." But the raids continued. Within a month, 6 critical alliances had destabilized. Trade routes collapsed. Border skirmishes escalated into full assaults. And worst of all, whispers began spreading through the court. Whispers that the Silent Queen had not simply disappeared. She had abandoned them. Kaelin stood in his private study late one night, staring at a stack of documents Orin had brought him. Reports, letters, contracts, all of them signed by Lyra. All of them holding together pieces of his empire he hadn't even known were fragile. He read through them one by one, his expression hardening with each page. She had been working in the shadows for years, deflecting threats, securing alliances, plugging holes in his kingdom's foundation before he ever knew they existed. And he had never once asked her how. Kaelin set the papers down and walked to the window, staring out at the moonlit courtyard. For the first time in his life, the Alpha King felt the cold edge of doubt. 3 months after Lyra's disappearance, Kaelin received the first credible lead. A merchant traveling through the Ashen North brought word of a silver-haired woman who had appeared in the ruined territories beyond the Empire's reach. She was organizing the exiled clans, offering sanctuary to wolves cast out by their own packs. Building something new. Kaelin questioned the merchant personally. You're certain it was her? The merchant nodded, his voice shaking. I saw her myself, Your Majesty. She didn't hide. She stood in the center of the camp, surrounded by families, and she spoke like someone who had been leading armies her whole life. Kaelin dismissed the man and sat alone in the throne room, his hands curled into fists. She wasn't hiding. She was building a kingdom without him. But Mukgyet. Kaelin left for the Ashen North at dawn. He took only Orin and a small contingent of his most trusted warriors. No banners, no announcements. This was not a royal procession. This was a hunt. The journey north took 2 weeks, through frozen wastelands and territories so broken even bandits didn't bother claiming them. The closer they got, the more Kaelin saw signs of Lyra's influence, camps organized with military precision, supply lines that shouldn't exist, families who looked at his approach not with fear, but with cold defiance. She had built this, all of it. On the final night before reaching her sanctuary, Kaelin sat by the fire, staring into the flames. Orin approached cautiously. Your Majesty, what will you say to her? Kaelin didn't answer, because for the first time in his life, the Alpha King had no idea what words could possibly be enough. The sanctuary sat nestled in a valley surrounded by jagged peaks, hidden from the Empire's eyes and protected by wolves who had nothing left to lose. Kaelin approached alone, leaving his warriors at the ridge. Lyra stood at the center of the camp, her silver hair unbound and catching the light like molten steel. She wore simple leather and furs, no crown, no gown, nothing that marked her as the woman who had once stood silent in his shadow. She looked like a queen. Their eyes met across the distance, and Kaelin realized, with a clarity that burned like frostbite, that he had spent 7 years standing beside a woman he had never truly seen. Lyra's expression didn't change. She simply turned and walked toward the largest tent, her voice carrying across the snow. If you've come to drag me back, Kaelin, you're going to need a bigger army. And for the first time in months, the Empire's most powerful alpha had absolutely no idea what happened next. Kaelin stood at the edge of the camp, his breath fogging in the frozen air, watching Lyra disappear into the tent like she hadn't just dismissed the most dangerous man in the Empire. The wolves around him didn't move, didn't lower their eyes, didn't acknowledge his authority at all. They watched him the way predators watched intruders. Orin appeared at his shoulder, his hand hovering near his blade. Your Majesty, should we? No. Kaelin's voice was granite. I go alone, but I said no. Orin stepped back. Kaelin moved through the camp with measured steps, cataloging everything. The fires were positioned for maximum warmth and visibility. Supply tents organized like military barracks. Families clustered in groups that suggested clan structure, not chaos. This wasn't a refugee camp. This was an army waiting to happen. He reached the tent and pushed through the entrance without announcing himself. Lyra stood with her back to him, pouring something hot into 2 wooden cups. Steam curled upward in lazy spirals. She didn't turn around. Close the flap. It's cold. Kaelin let the leather drop behind him, sealing them inside. The space was sparse. A cot. A table covered in maps. A single lantern casting shadows against canvas walls. No luxury. No softness. She turned and held out one of the cups. He didn't take it. Her expression remained neutral. Suit yourself. She sat on a wooden stool and took a slow sip, her silver hair falling over one shoulder. The silence stretched between them like a drawn blade. Kaelin finally spoke. You left. I did. Without a word. Lyra's eyes lifted to meet his. I said plenty of words over 7 years. You just never bothered listening. Her voice was calm. That was somehow worse than rage. Kaelin's jaw tightened. The Empire is falling apart. Is it? She sounded genuinely curious, like she was asking about the weather. 6 alliances have collapsed. The Eastern Territories are in open rebellion. Trade routes are destroyed. His voice hardened. You knew this would happen. Lyra set her cup down with deliberate care. I knew what held your empire together, and I knew what would happen when that support disappeared. Support. Kaelin's voice dropped to something dangerous. Is that what you call abandoning your responsibilities? Lyra laughed. It wasn't a pleasant sound. It was sharp and cutting and completely devoid of humor. My responsibilities. She stood, and despite being smaller than him, despite the tent being his empire's territory in every way that mattered, she somehow filled the space. Tell me, Kaelin. What exactly were my responsibilities? Stand 3 seats away while your court mocked me. Smile while nobles questioned my worth. Bleed in the shadows, fixing your mistakes while you took credit for every victory I handed you. I never asked you to. You never asked me for anything. Her voice cracked like a whip. That was the problem. You just took. Took my loyalty, took my strategies, took 7 years of my life and treated me like furniture that occasionally proved useful. Kaylin's hands curled into fists. I gave you everything. A title, a position, protection. You gave me a cage. Lyra stepped closer, and Kaylin saw something in her eyes he'd never seen before. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't pleading. She was done. I protected your throne from threats you never even knew existed. I negotiated alliances that kept your borders secure. I stopped 3 assassination attempts in 1 year alone. And when Lady Seraphine questioned whether I was strong enough to bear your heirs in front of the entire court, you said nothing. That's what this is about? Kaylin's voice rose. Court gossip? No. Lyra's voice went quiet. Deadly quiet. This is about you sitting there and letting it happen. This is about you valuing everyone's opinion except mine. This is about me finally realizing that I can build something stronger without you than I ever could beside you. The words hit harder than any physical blow. Kaylin stared at her, and for the first time in his life he had no response that would win this fight. The tent flap opened. A young wolf stepped inside, barely 16, his eyes darting between them. My lady, the Eastern Scouts are back. They're requesting your counsel. Lyra's expression shifted immediately. Tell them I'll be there in 5 minutes. The boy nodded and disappeared. Kaylin's eyes narrowed. My lady? Lyra moved to the table and began rolling up maps. These people needed someone who sees them, someone who doesn't measure worth by bloodline or brute strength, someone who understands what it means to be invisible. You're building an army. I'm building a home. She glanced at him. There's a difference. Against me. Lyra stopped. Her hands rested flat on the table. I'm not against you, Kaylin. I'm just not for you anymore. There's a difference there, too. She moved toward the tent entrance, then paused. You came all this way. Why? The question caught him off guard. Because the Empire is collapsing, he said. Because I need... No. Lyra turned to face him fully. Not why you need me. Why did you come? Yourself. Alone. Why? Kaylin opened his mouth, closed it. The silence stretched. Lyra's expression softened slightly. That's what I thought. She left. Kaylin stood alone in the tent, surrounded by maps of territories he didn't recognize, and felt something crack in his chest that had nothing to do with the Empire. He stayed at the camp for 3 days, not as the Alpha King making demands, not as the ruler expecting obedience, as an observer who no longer had any power at all. He watched Lyra settle disputes between clans with the precision of someone who understood pack dynamics better than most alphas. He watched her train young wolves in strategy, her voice sharp and patient in equal measure. He watched families look at her with loyalty that couldn't be commanded or bought. She had built this in 3 months. 3 months. It had taken him 7 years to break what they'd had, and she'd built something stronger in a fraction of that time. On the second night, Kaylin found her standing alone at the edge of the camp, staring out at the frozen wasteland beyond. He approached slowly. She didn't turn around. They stood in silence for a long moment. I didn't see you, Kaylin said finally. No, you didn't. I should have. Lyra's breath misted in the cold air. Seeing me wouldn't have been enough, Kaylin. You would have needed to value what you saw. There's a difference. He had no answer for that. Lyra turned to face him, and in the moonlight she looked like something carved from ice and fury and hard-won survival. When I stood beside you, I made myself small. I thought if I was quiet enough, useful enough, indispensable enough, you would eventually notice. But you can't make someone see you by disappearing. I learned that too late. It's not too late. Yes. Her voice was certain. It is. The woman you ignored doesn't exist anymore. She died somewhere around year 5. This version of me doesn't fit in your empire, Kaylin. She barely fits in her own skin most days. But at least here, she doesn't have to apologize for taking up space. What do you want from me? Nothing. That's the point. I don't want anything from you anymore. The words should have felt like relief. They felt like losing. Lyra moved to walk past him, then paused. The southern warlord you made an alliance with last year, Darius Vane. What about him? Her eyes met his. He's been stealing from your armories for 6 months, selling weapons to your enemies. He's planning a coup. Kaylin's blood went cold. How do you know that? Because I've been tracking his movements since before I left. She pulled a folded paper from her coat and handed it to him. Names, dates, supply routes, everything you need to burn his operation to the ground. Kaylin unfolded it. The information was meticulous, damning. Why are you giving this to me? Lyra's expression was unreadable. Because I'm not your enemy, Kaylin. I'm just not your solution anymore. What you do with that information is your choice. But if Darius moves against you, he'll come through the Western Pass in exactly 11 days, and you'll lose half your territory before you even know the war started. She walked away, leaving him standing in the snow with proof of a betrayal he'd been too blind to see. Bakot. Kaylin returned to his empire the next morning. Oren rode beside him, silent and watchful. Your Majesty, Oren said carefully, what are your orders? Find Darius Vane. Kaylin's voice was cold. Bring him to me alive. And the Queen? Kaylin stared at the horizon. She's not coming back. Oren said nothing. They rode in silence for an hour before Kaylin spoke again. How long did you know? Know what, Your Majesty? That Lyra was holding the Empire together. Oren's jaw tightened. Long enough to realize you didn't. Kaylin glanced at him sharply. Oren met his eyes without flinching. I served you because you're the Alpha King. I respected her because she never needed the title to lead. There's a difference. It was the second time someone had told him that. Kaylin turned his attention back to the road and said nothing. But they reached the capital 4 days later. Kaylin called an emergency council the moment he entered the palace. Every lord, every warlord, every noble who had spent the last 3 months whispering about the Silent Queen's disappearance. He walked into the war room and threw Lyra's report onto the table. Darius Vane is a traitor. He's been arming our enemies and planning to seize the Western territories. We have 11 days before he moves. The room erupted into chaos. Lord Brennan picked up the report, his face draining of color. How did you... It doesn't matter how. Kaylin's voice cut through the noise like a blade. What matters is that we respond. Now. Lady Seraphine, seated at the far end, leaned forward with a carefully constructed expression of concern. Your Majesty, with all respect, how can we trust intelligence from a source that abandoned the Empire? Kaylin's eyes locked onto hers. The room went silent. When he spoke, his voice was laced with ice. The Queen didn't abandon the Empire. The Empire failed her. And if any of you question her intelligence again, you'll answer to me personally. Seraphine's face went pale. Kaylin turned to Oren. Mobilize the Northern Legions. I want Darius and every conspirator in chains within the week. Oren nodded and left. Kaylin looked around the table at the nobles who had whispered and schemed and undermined Lyra for years. Let me be clear. The reason this empire is still standing is because of her. Every alliance you take for granted, every border that's held, every threat that never reached your doorstep, that was her work. And while you mocked her silence, she was saving all of you from your own incompetence. No one spoke. Kaylin's voice dropped. She's gone. And you're going to feel that absence every single day until you understand what you lost. He left the war room and walked through the empty halls of a palace that suddenly felt like a mausoleum. Darius Vane was arrested 6 days later. He didn't go quietly. It took 3 of Kaylin's best warriors to drag him into the throne room, his face bloodied and defiant. Kaylin sat on the throne, his expression carved from stone. Darius spat blood onto the marble floor. You think this changes anything? You're already finished, Draven. Your empire is rotting from the inside. I'm just the one brave enough to take what's left. Kaylin descended the steps slowly. Who else? Darius laughed. You'll never know. They're everywhere. In your guard. In your council. In your bed. Kaylin's fist connected with Darius's jaw so hard the crack echoed through the hall. Darius hit the ground, blood pouring from his mouth. Kaylin crouched beside him, his voice deadly calm. Lyra knew. She knew every name, every conspirator, every detail of your pathetic rebellion, and she gave me everything I needed to end you. Darius's eyes widened. The woman you all dismissed as weak just destroyed you without lifting a blade. Kaylin stood. Execute him at dawn. Public. I want every traitor in this empire to see what happens when they underestimate silence. Darius was dragged away, screaming threats that meant nothing. Kalen stood alone in the throne room and stared at the empty seat 3 places from his own. The seat Lyra had occupied for 7 years while the Empire ignored her. News of the execution spread fast. Within days, 3 more conspirators turned themselves in, terrified that Lyra's intelligence network had exposed them too. The Empire stabilized. Barely. But Kalen felt the cracks everywhere. Trade routes that used to flow smoothly now required constant negotiation. Alliances that once felt secure now demanded personal attention. Work that Lyra had handled invisibly now consumed hours of his day. He had ruled an empire. She had held it together. He finally understood the difference. 1 month after executing Darius, Kalen received word that Lyra's sanctuary in the north had been attacked. Not by his forces. By Matthias Kane, the Eastern Alpha who saw weakness and pounced. Kalen was in the war room when Oren delivered the news. How bad? Oren's face was grim. Kane brought 200 wolves. The sanctuary was defended by maybe 50, most of them families. Kalen's blood went cold. Casualties. Unknown. But Kane's not interested in mercy. He sees the sanctuary as a rival power base. He wants it burned to the ground. Kalen stared at the map on the table, at the tiny mark indicating the northern valley where Lyra had built something worth protecting. She wasn't his anymore. She'd made that clear, but the thought of her fighting a warlord's army with refugees and exiles made something primal surge in his chest. Mobilize every available legion. We leave within the hour. Oren blinked. Your Majesty, the sanctuary isn't technically part of the Empire. If we intervene, I don't care. Kalen's voice was absolute. Move, now. Oren left. Kalen stood alone staring at the map and made a choice that had nothing to do with politics or power or pride. For the first time in 7 years, he was choosing her, even if she never forgave him for taking so long. Yimmasets. They rode through the night, pushing the horses to the edge of collapse. Kalen's mind raced through worst-case scenarios, each one worse than the last. Lyra was brilliant. She was strategic. She was ruthless when needed, but she was also outnumbered 4-1. They reached the valley at dawn. Smoke rose from the camp. The sounds of battle echoed off the mountains. Kalen didn't wait for strategy or formations. He charged. His legion followed, crashing into Kane's forces like a tidal wave of fur and fury. The battlefield exploded into chaos. Kalen tore through enemy wolves with the kind of violence that came from something deeper than duty. He fought his way toward the center of the camp, where he could see Lyra standing on a raised platform, directing her wolves with precision even as blood streaked her face. She saw him. Their eyes locked across the carnage, and for one suspended moment, the war disappeared. Then Matthias Kane appeared behind her, blade raised. Kalen's roar shattered the air. He moved faster than thought, faster than reason, crossing the distance in heartbeats. He slammed into Kane with enough force to crack ribs, and they hit the ground in a tangle of limbs and rage. Kane snarled. You're too late, Draven. This territory is mine. Kalen's claws found Kane's throat. Wrong. He ended it quickly, brutally. When he stood, blood dripping from his hands, the battle was already over. Kane's forces scattered. The sanctuary held. Lyra stood 3 feet away, breathing hard, her silver hair matted with dirt and blood. You came. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. Kalen met her eyes. I couldn't let you fight this alone. Lyra's expression cracked, just for a second. Then the armor came back up. I've been fighting alone for 7 years. I know. The words were simple, insufficient, but they were true. Lyra turned away, already issuing orders to her people, already moving forward because that's what she did. Kalen watched her walk away and realized that coming here wasn't about saving her. It was about proving he finally understood what he'd lost, and that the only way forward was to become someone worthy of standing beside her again, even if it took the rest of his life. The dead littered the valley floor like broken toys discarded by a careless child. Kalen stood in the center of the carnage, his chest heaving, blood cooling on his hands. Around him, Lyra's wolves moved through the aftermath with grim efficiency, collecting weapons, tending wounds, burning bodies before disease could take root. He watched Lyra crouch beside a young girl no older than 12, her hands gentle as she wrapped a gash on the child's arm. The girl looked up at her with something approaching worship. Lyra said something too quiet for Kalen to hear, and the girl nodded before running toward the medical tent. Lyra stood, her silver hair catching the morning light. and their eyes met across the smoke and ash. She walked toward him with measured steps. Her face was unreadable. "Your legion saved us." Her voice was neutral, clinical. "Thank you." Kalen's jaw tightened. "Don't thank me like I'm a stranger doing you a favor. Aren't you?" The words cut deeper than Kane's blade ever could. Before Kalen could respond, Orin appeared, his expression tight. "Your Majesty, we need to move. Kane's forces are scattered but not broken. They'll regroup within days." Lyra glanced at Orin, then back at Kalen. "He's right. This valley isn't defensible against a prolonged siege. We need to relocate." "Where?" Kalen's voice was flat. "West. There's a fortress in the old territories. Abandoned for decades, but the bones are solid. We can fortify it. That's 3 weeks of travel through hostile terrain." Lyra's eyes hardened. "Then I suggest we move fast." Kalen studied her, searching for something in her expression that suggested she wanted him here, that she needed him. He found nothing. "My legion will escort you. We'll secure the fortress and establish a perimeter." Lyra's lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't need—" "Yes, you do." Kalen's voice left no room for argument. Kane wasn't acting alone. Someone pointed him toward this valley. Someone told him you were vulnerable. Until we know who, you're a target. Lyra held his gaze for a long moment, and Kalen saw the calculation happening behind her eyes. She was weighing risks, measuring threats, deciding whether accepting his help was worth the cost of having him close. Finally, she nodded once. "Fine. But your legion follows my command while we're on the move. This isn't your empire anymore, Kalen. Out here, I'm in charge." It should have felt like an insult. Instead, it felt like watching someone he'd underestimated for years finally show their teeth. "Agreed." Lyra turned and walked away, already issuing orders to her wolves. Orin moved to Kalen's side, his voice low. "Your Majesty, are you certain about this? We're spreading our forces thin. If the capital is attacked while the capital will hold." Kalen didn't take his eyes off Lyra. "This is where we're needed." Orin said nothing, but Kalen could feel the weight of his second's doubt. They buried the dead before nightfall and moved out at dawn. The journey west was brutal. They traveled through territories so broken even the wind seemed angry. Freezing rain turned the ground into mud that sucked at boots and hooves. Lyra's people moved with the efficiency of wolves who'd spent their entire lives surviving on scraps and willpower. Kalen's legion, trained for battlefield dominance, struggled with the relentless pace she set. On the 4th night, Kalen found Lyra standing watch on a ridge overlooking their camp. The moon was a sliver of bone-white light against black sky. He approached without speaking, and they stood in silence for several minutes. "You're pushing too hard," Kalen finally said. "Your people are exhausted. My people are alive." Lyra's voice was quiet. "Exhausted is a luxury we can afford once we reach the fortress. At this pace, half of them won't make it." Lyra turned to face him, and her eyes were cold. "Then they die free, instead of in chains. That's the choice out here, Kalen. There is no middle ground." The words landed like stones. Kalen stared at her, and something shifted in his understanding. This wasn't the woman who'd stood silent in his court. This was someone who'd been forged in the exact kind of fire he'd spent his entire life avoiding. She'd lost everything and built it back with nothing but will and rage and a refusal to break. She was magnificent, and he'd been too blind to see it when she stood right beside him. "Your intelligence on Kane," Kalen said. "How did you know he'd attack?" Lyra's expression flickered. "I didn't, not for certain. But you suspected. I suspect everyone. It's how you survive when you've spent years watching people smile to your face and sharpen knives behind your back." The bitterness in her voice was a living thing. Kalen's hands curled into fists. "If I could go back—" "You can't." Lyra cut him off. "That's the point. You can't undo 7 years of being invisible. You can't apologize away the fact that I bled for your empire while your court treated me like decoration. What's done is done." "Then what do I do now?" Lyra looked at him, and for the first time, something other than anger flickered in her eyes. "You stop trying to fix the past. You decide who you want to be moving forward, and you live with the fact that it might not be enough." She walked away, leaving Kalen standing on the ridge with the weight of every mistake he'd ever made pressing against his chest like a physical thing. They reached the fortress on the 18th day. It was a skeleton of stone and iron rising from the wasteland like the corpse of some ancient beast. The walls were crumbling in places, the gates rusted, but the foundation was solid, defensible. Lyra walked through the ruins with the focus of a general surveying a battlefield. She pointed to weak points, issued orders for repairs, organized supply lines with the kind of precision that came from understanding logistics at a bone-deep level. Kalen watched her transform a ruin into a stronghold in less than 3 days. His legion worked alongside her wolves, and slowly, grudgingly, the two groups began to function as a single unit. Shared labor bred shared respect. By the end of the first week, Kalen's warriors stopped referring to Lyra's people as refugees and started calling them by name. On the 9th night, Orin found Kalen in the fortress's war room, staring at maps spread across a table that had probably been abandoned for half a century. "Your Majesty." Orin's voice was careful. "A messenger arrived from the capital. Lord Brennan requests your immediate return." "Why?" "There's unrest. The nobles are questioning your prolonged absence. Lady Seraphine has been calling emergency councils." "Of course she has." Kalen's voice was dry. "What does she want?" Orin hesitated. "She's suggesting that your attachment to the former queen is compromising your judgment." Kalen's eyes lifted. She said that. Not in those exact words, but the implication was clear. "Tell Brennan I'll return when the fortress is secure. Not before. Your Majesty, if you don't address this soon, Seraphine will use it to undermine—" "Let her try." Kalen's voice was cold. "I've dealt with bigger threats than ambitious nobles playing political games." Orin nodded slowly and left. Kalen stared at the maps, but his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about Lyra standing in the ruins issuing orders, about her wolves looking at her with loyalty that couldn't be bought or commanded, about the way she'd built something real while his empire held together with fear and fragile alliances. He was thinking about how easily a kingdom could crumble when the foundation was rotten. Bites. The attack came 3 nights later, not from Kane's scattered forces, from inside. Kalen woke to the sound of steel on steel and the acrid smell of smoke. He was on his feet instantly, blade in hand, moving through corridors lit orange by flames. The fortress was under siege, but the enemy wasn't at the gates, they were already inside. He found Orin in the central courtyard, fighting back-to-back with 2 of Lyra's wolves against a group of attackers wearing the colors of Kalen's own legion. Betrayal was a knife twisting in Kalen's gut. He threw himself into the fight with the kind of violence that came from feeling the ground disappear beneath his feet. His blade found throats and hearts with mechanical precision. Blood sprayed. Bodies fell. When the immediate threat was down, Kalen grabbed one of the traitors by the throat and slammed him against the stone wall. "Who sent you?" The wolf spat blood in his face. Kalen tightened his grip. "Who?" The wolf's eyes rolled back. He went limp, dead before he could talk. Kalen dropped the body and turned to Orin. "How many?" "Unknown. They're hitting the armory and the supply stores. Coordinated assault. Where's Lyra?" Orin's face went pale. "The South Tower. They're targeting her specifically." Kalen ran. He tore through burning corridors and over bodies of wolves who'd been murdered in their sleep. The South Tower loomed ahead, smoke pouring from its windows. He took the stairs 3 at a time, found Lyra on the top floor surrounded by 6 attackers, her blades slick with blood. She was holding them off, but barely. A gash across her ribs bled freely. Her breathing was labored. Kalen hit the group like a battering ram. The fight was brutal and short. These weren't soldiers. They were assassins. Fast, precise, trained to kill, not to fight fair. Kalen ended them anyway. When the last body hit the floor, he turned to Lyra. She was leaning against the wall, one hand pressed to her ribs. "You're hurt." "I'm fine." Her voice was tight with pain. Lies. Kalen moved to her side, pulling her hand away to inspect the wound. Deep, but not fatal, still bleeding too much. "We need to get you to the medical—" "No." Lyra's eyes were sharp despite the pain. "We need to find out who sent them." This wasn't random. Someone knew exactly where I'd be. Kalen's jaw clenched. His mind was already working through possibilities, sorting through faces, alliances, weaknesses. Then Orin appeared in the doorway, his expression carved from stone. "Your Majesty, we found something." He held out a sealed letter, its wax stamp bearing a crest Kalen recognized immediately. The Draven Royal seal. His seal. Kalen's blood went cold. He took the letter and broke it open. Inside was a single page of parchment. Orders written in formal script. Orders to eliminate Lyra Vale and any wolves loyal to her. Orders to secure the fortress for the crown. Orders signed with his name. The world tilted. Kalen stared at the paper, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. Lyra took the letter from his numb fingers. Read it. Her face drained of color. When she looked at him, the betrayal in her eyes was a physical wound. You signed this. No. Kalen's voice was raw. I didn't. I would never. It has your seal, your signature. It's a forgery. Convenient. Lyra's voice shook. Very convenient. Kalen reached for her. Lyra. She stepped back, blade rising. Don't. The distance between them suddenly felt like miles. Orrin cleared his throat. Your Majesty, there's more. We found correspondence in the captain's quarters. Someone in the capital has been feeding information to your enemies. Troop movements, supply routes, weaknesses in your defenses. Who? Kalen's voice was deadly quiet. Orrin hesitated. The letters are signed by Lord Brennan. The name hit like a hammer. Brennan. One of his oldest allies. A man who'd sat at his war table for a decade. A man he trusted without question. Kalen's hands started shaking. Not from fear. From rage so absolute it threatened to consume him whole. Lyra was still watching him, her blade steady despite the blood soaking her side. How do I know you're not behind this? How do I know this isn't exactly what you wanted? To get close, gain my trust, and destroy everything I built. Because if I wanted you dead, Kalen said, his voice breaking, you'd have been dead 7 years ago. Because the only thing I've wanted since you left was a chance to prove I could be someone worthy of standing beside you. Because destroying you would be destroying the only thing in my life that was ever real. The words hung in the smoke-filled air. Lyra's blade lowered, just an inch. Then prove it. Her voice was ice. Find out who did this. Find out who's been playing us both. And when you do, you burn them to the ground. Kalen met her eyes. I will. Because in that moment, standing in the ruins of another betrayal, Kalen understood something fundamental about power. It wasn't about being the strongest. It was about knowing who to trust. And he'd spent 7 years trusting the wrong people while ignoring the one person who'd actually been loyal. That ended now. But Gocham. They worked through the night interrogating survivors and piecing together the conspiracy. The picture that emerged was worse than Kalen had imagined. Brennan hadn't acted alone. Lady Seraphine. 3 members of the Royal Guard. Even some of the nobles Kalen had considered allies for years. They'd been planning this for months, using Lyra's disappearance as the perfect cover, framing Kalen's pursuit of her as weakness, positioning themselves to seize power the moment he was vulnerable. The forged execution order was meant to do 2 things: eliminate Lyra and frame Kalen for her murder. Destroy the woman who knew too much and the king who'd become a liability. It was brilliant. It almost worked. By dawn, Kalen had names, locations, a full map of the conspiracy that had been eating his empire from the inside. He stood in the fortress courtyard as the sun broke over the eastern mountains, exhaustion pulling at his bones. Lyra appeared beside him, her ribs bandaged, her face pale but determined. What now? She asked. Now. Kalen's voice was granite. We go back to the capital, and we tear them apart. Together. It wasn't a question. Lyra looked at him, and something in her eyes shifted. Not forgiveness, not trust, but maybe the beginning of a possibility. Together. They mobilized within the hour. Every loyal wolf, every soldier who'd proven themselves in the night's bloodshed. A force built not from fear, but from the kind of rage that came from being betrayed by people who should have known better. The ride back to the capital took 12 days. 12 days of hard travel and harder planning. 12 days of Kalen and Lyra working side by side, their combined tactical minds creating something neither could have built alone. On the 11th night, camped in the ruins of an old watchtower, Lyra spoke quietly. If we do this, there's no going back. You'll be declaring war on half your own court. I know. You'll lose allies, resources, maybe even the throne itself. Kalen looked at her, and for the first time in his life, he understood what mattered. I already lost the only thing that mattered. Everything else is just noise. Lyra held his gaze. Don't make promises you can't keep. I'm not. Kalen's voice was certain. I'm making a choice. Finally. The next morning, they reached the capital. The city sprawled before them, beautiful and corrupt, and completely unaware of the reckoning riding toward its gates. Kaelin and Lyra sat on horseback side by side, an army at their backs, and stared at the empire that had failed them both. "This ends today," Kaelin said. Lyra's hand moved to her blade. "Yes, it does." They rode through the gates like vengeance given form, and the empire would never be the same. The gates of the capital swung open, not in welcome, but in shock. Guards scrambled for weapons they'd never expected to draw against their own king. Citizens scattered from the main thoroughfare as Kaelin's combined force rode through streets that had once belonged to him without question. Now they belonged to whoever was strong enough to take them. Kaelin sat tall in the saddle, his face carved from ice and fury. Beside him, Lyra rode with the posture of someone who'd already died once and found the experience liberating. Behind them, 200 wolves moved with the synchronized menace of a single predator. They didn't stop, didn't slow, didn't acknowledge the confusion spreading through the streets like wildfire. They rode straight for the palace. The Moonstone Palace rose before them, its white marble walls gleaming in afternoon sunlight. Beautiful, pristine, but built on a foundation of lies Kaelin had been too arrogant to see. He dismounted in the main courtyard. Lyra hit the ground beside him. Orin materialized at his shoulder. "Your Majesty, the palace guard is mobilizing. They're receiving orders from inside." "From who?" "Lord Brennan. He's barricaded himself in the throne room with Lady Seraphine and the other conspirators. They're claiming you've been compromised, that you're acting under the influence of a traitor." Kaelin's laugh was devoid of humor. "Of course they are." Lyra's hand rested on her blade. "How many guards?" Orin's expression was grim. "At least 50 between here and the throne room. They're loyal to the crown, not necessarily to you. They won't know which side to take. Then we make it clear." Kaelin started walking. The palace doors stood closed, sealed, as if wood and iron could keep out the reckoning riding toward them on waves of accumulated rage. Kaelin didn't break stride. He slammed his shoulder into the doors with enough force to crack the bar on the other side. The wood splintered. The doors burst inward. Inside the palace was chaos. Servants fled down corridors. Guards formed hasty defensive lines. Nobles who'd spent years drinking his wine and enjoying his protection suddenly found themselves trapped between an alpha king who'd finally remembered what fangs were for and a silent queen who'd never forgotten. The first line of guards blocked the main hallway, spears lowered, faces pale but determined. Their captain stepped forward. "Your Majesty, please. We have orders to prevent Stand aside." Kaelin's voice carried the weight of absolute authority. The captain hesitated. "We can't. Lord Brennan has declared you unfit to—" "I am your king." Kaelin's eyes blazed. "And I'm giving you one chance to choose correctly. Stand aside or be removed." The hallway held its breath. Then slowly, incrementally, the guards stepped back. Not all of them. 5 held their ground, loyalty to Brennan outweighing fear of Kaelin. Lyra moved before Kaelin could. She was a silver blur of controlled violence, her blade finding gaps in armor with surgical precision. She didn't kill, didn't need to. Within seconds, all 5 were on the ground, disarmed and bleeding but alive. She straightened, blood spattering her face. "Keep moving." They advanced through the palace like a storm front. Each corridor brought new resistance. Each resistance crumbled before the combined force of Kaelin's rage and Lyra's lethal efficiency. They were unstoppable because they'd both already lost everything that mattered. Fear had nothing left to take from them. The throne room doors loomed ahead, massive oak reinforced with iron bands, sealed from the inside. Kaelin stopped 3 feet away and raised his voice. "Brennan, I know you're in there. I know what you've done. And I'm giving you one chance to open these doors and face me." Silence. Then Brennan's voice filtered through the wood, measured and calm. "Your Majesty, please. You're not thinking clearly. That woman has poisoned your mind against your own people. That woman saved your miserable life 12 times while you plotted to take my throne. I plotted nothing." Brennan's tone shifted to something approaching sincerity. "I tried to save the Empire from a king who abandoned his duties to chase after a discarded mate." Discarded. Kaelin's hands curled into fists. "You have no idea what you threw away." She was weak. Seraphine's voice joined Brennan's, sharp and venomous. Silent, useless. The Empire needed strength, not a decorative ghost haunting the court. Lyra stepped forward. Her voice was quiet, but it carried like a blade sliding from its sheath. I was silent because I was doing your jobs while you schemed and postured. I was useful in ways you'll never comprehend. And the only ghost haunting anything will be your reputation after I'm done exposing every corrupt deal you've made in the last decade. The silence that followed was absolute. Kalen's voice dropped to something dangerous. Last chance, open the doors, go to hell. Wrong answer. Kalen nodded to Oren. The battering ram. It took 6 of his strongest wolves to carry it, a tree trunk capped with iron, designed to break siege walls. They swung it once, twice. On the third impact, the doors exploded inward in a shower of splinters and twisted metal. The throne room was exactly as Kalen remembered. Vaulted ceilings, stained glass windows throwing colored light across marble floors. His throne sitting elevated at the far end, and surrounding it 20 armed wolves loyal to Brennan and Seraphine. Brennan stood behind the throne itself, one hand resting possessively on the armrest. Seraphine stood to his right, her red dress a splash of blood against white stone. They looked confident, prepared, like they'd wargamed this exact scenario. They hadn't wargamed Lyra. She moved before anyone could react. While Kalen's wolves poured through the shattered doors and engaged Brennan's forces, Lyra cut a surgical path straight toward the throne. Guards fell in her wake. She was poetry written in violence, every movement economical and brutal. Kalen fought his way forward, his focus narrowed to Brennan, the man who'd sat at his war table, who'd toasted his victories, who'd smiled while sharpening a knife meant for his back. Their blades met in the center of the throne room with a sound like thunder. Brennan was good, trained, experienced, but Kalen was fury given form. They traded blows that would have killed lesser wolves. Brennan fought with technique and precision. Kalen fought with the accumulated rage of 7 years of being blind and 5 months of watching his empire crumble because he'd been too proud to see the woman holding it together. Every strike was an accusation. Every parry was a rejection of the man he'd been. Around them, the throne room descended into chaos. Lyra's wolves clashed with Brennan's loyalists. Blood sprayed across marble. Bodies fell. The beautiful palace became a battlefield soaked in betrayal and broken oaths. Kalen drove Brennan back step by step. His former advisor's confidence cracked, then shattered. "You can't win this," Brennan gasped, blocking a strike that nearly took his head. "Kill me, and you prove them right. Prove you're unstable, dangerous." Kalen's blade found Brennan's shoulder, twisted. The older wolf screamed, "I don't need to prove anything anymore." Kalen's voice was cold. "I just need you gone." He disarmed Brennan with a move Lyra had taught him years ago during a training session he'd barely paid attention to. The blade clattered across the floor. Brennan fell to his knees. Kalen stood over him, chest heaving. Every instinct screamed to end it, to paint the throne room floor with the blood of a traitor who'd almost destroyed everything. But something made him hesitate. Not mercy, not weakness. The realization that killing Brennan proved nothing. That executing him in rage was exactly what they'd expect from the old Kalen. The one who ruled through fear and never questioned his own power. He lowered his blade. "Get out!" Kalen's voice carried to every corner of the room. The fighting paused. "Take your conspirators and get out of my empire. If I ever see your face again, I'll finish this." Brennan stared up at him, shock written across his face. But before anyone could move, Seraphine screamed. She'd been backed into a corner by Lyra, blade to her throat. Now she twisted with desperate strength, breaking free. Her hand found a hidden dagger. She lunged not at Lyra, but at Kalen's exposed back. Lyra moved, faster than thought, faster than breath. She threw herself between Seraphine's blade and Kalen's spine. The dagger meant for him buried itself in her side instead. Time fractured. Kalen spun, saw Lyra stumble, saw blood blooming across her ribs, saw Seraphine's triumphant expression crumble into horror as she realized what she'd just done. The sound that tore from Kalen's throat was inhuman. He caught Lyra before she hit the ground. Her weight was nothing. Her blood was everything. Her eyes met his, wide and shocked. "Well?" Her voice was breathless. "Guess we're even now. Don't." Kalen's hands pressed against the wound, but blood poured between his fingers. "Don't you dare." Around them, the battle ended. Brennan's forces threw down their weapons. Seraphine stood frozen, the dagger still in her hand, her face drained of all color. Lyra's breathing was shallow. "Medic!" Kalen's roar shook the rafters. "Now!" Oren was there instantly, applying pressure, barking orders. Wolves scattered to find supplies. The throne room transformed from a battlefield to a desperate medical operation in seconds. Lyra's hand found Kaelin's. Her grip was weak, her fingers cold. "Stay with me." Kaelin's voice broke. "Please, I just found you. You don't get to leave now." Dramatic. Lyra's lips curved into a faint smile, but her eyes were unfocused, losing the light that made them fierce. A medic appeared. Older wolf. Scarred hands that moved with steady confidence. He examined the wound, his expression grim. The blade hit deep. Possibly nicked something vital. "I can stabilize her, but she needs proper surgery. Clean environment, tools I don't have here. Then get them." Kaelin didn't look away from Lyra's face. "Your Majesty, moving her could—" "I said get them." Kaelin's voice was absolute. "Tear this palace apart if you have to. Save her." The medic nodded and started issuing rapid orders. Lyra's hand tightened fractionally on Kaelin's. "Idiot." Her voice was barely a whisper. "You should have let me die 7 years ago. Would have saved us both a lot of trouble." "Shut up." Kaelin's vision blurred. "Just shut up and breathe. Bossy. Even now." Her eyes drifted closed. "Lyra." Kaelin shook her gently. "Open your eyes. Look at me." She did. Barely. "Why?" "Because I need you to hear this." Kaelin's voice steadied. "Everything I built means nothing without you. The throne, the empire, all of it. You were the foundation and I was too blind to see it. So you don't get to die. You don't get to leave me here with this broken kingdom and no idea how to fix it. You stay. You fight. And when you're healed, we rebuild everything together." Lyra's lips moved. Couldn't hear the words. Kaelin leaned closer. Her breath was warm against his ear. Finally figured it out. Her voice was the faintest thread. "Only took you nearly killing us both." Then her eyes closed and didn't open. The medic worked with frantic precision. Bandages, pressure, whispered consultations with other healers who'd appeared from somewhere. Minutes stretched into hours. Kaelin refused to move, refused to let go of Lyra's hand. He knelt on blood-soaked marble in the center of his throne room, surrounded by the carnage of civil war, and held on to the only thing that had ever been real. Around him, Oren secured the palace. Brennan and Seraphine were placed in chains. The remaining conspirators surrendered without fight. The empire was his again. But Kaelin couldn't bring himself to care. Finally, as dawn light began filtering through the stained glass windows, the medic sat back. His hands were covered in blood. His face was exhausted. "She'll live." His voice was rough. Blade missed the vital organs by a finger's width. "She's lost a lot of blood, but she's strong. Stronger than anyone I've treated." Kaelin's breath left him in a rush. "How long? Weeks of recovery. Maybe months before she's battle-ready again. But she'll survive." The medic paused. "Your Majesty, she saved your life. That blade was meant for your heart." "I know." Kaelin's voice was barely audible. The medic gathered his supplies and left. Kaelin sat beside Lyra's still form, watching her chest rise and fall with shallow breaths. She looked fragile in a way he'd never seen her. Breakable. But he knew better now. She'd survived 7 years of being invisible. She'd built a kingdom from nothing. She'd thrown herself in front of a blade meant for him without hesitation. She was the strongest person he'd ever known, and he'd almost lost her because he'd been too proud to see it sooner. Oren approached quietly. "Your Majesty, what are your orders for the prisoners?" Kaelin didn't look away from Lyra. "Public trial, full disclosure of their conspiracy. Let the Empire see exactly what they tried to do. And Lady Seraphine." Kaelin's jaw tightened. The woman who'd questioned Lyra's worth, who'd smiled while undermining her, who'd just tried to murder the woman who'd saved the Empire more times than anyone knew. Execution. Kaelin's voice was ice. At dawn. Public. "I want every noble who ever dismissed Lyra to watch what happens when you try to destroy someone stronger than you'll ever be." Oren nodded and withdrew. Kaelin sat in silence, holding Lyra's hand, watching the sun rise over a capital city that had torn itself apart. 3 days later, Lyra's eyes opened. The first thing she saw was Kaelin slumped in a chair beside her bed, still wearing blood-stained clothes, dark circles carved under his eyes. "You look terrible." Her voice was hoarse. Kaelin's head snapped up. His expression cycled through relief and joy and something that looked dangerously close to tears. "You're awake." Brilliant observation. She tried to sit up, gasped, fell back. What happened? You took a blade meant for me, saved my life, nearly died. He recited it like facts that still didn't make sense. The medic says you'll recover, but it'll take time. Lyra processed this. Seraphine, executed yesterday, public. The entire court watched. Good. Kaelin leaned forward. Why did you do it? Lyra looked at him, really looked at him, at the exhaustion and fear and desperate hope written across his face. Because, her voice was quiet, someone had to save you from your own blind spots, and I'm apparently still stupid enough to think you're worth saving. Kaelin's breath shuddered. I don't deserve... No. Lyra cut him off. You don't, but maybe that's not the point anymore. Silence stretched between them, different than before, weighted with something fragile and new. What happens now? Kaelin asked. Lyra's eyes drifted to the window, to the city beyond. Now we decide if we're going to keep bleeding for an empire that never valued us, or if we're going to burn the whole thing down and build something better, together. Again, not a question. Lyra's hand tightened on his. Together. Outside, the city bells began to ring, not in mourning, not in celebration, in warning, because the real war hadn't even started yet. The bells continued ringing as Kaelin stood at the window of Lyra's recovery room, watching smoke rise from the eastern districts. The warning wasn't metaphorical. 3 separate fires burned across the capital. Riots had broken out in the merchant quarter, and according to the scouts Orin had just sent, an army was gathering at the Empire's border. Not Kane's scattered forces, not remnants of Brennan's conspiracy. Something bigger. Behind him, Lyra shifted in the bed. Her breathing was still labored but stronger than yesterday. When she spoke, her voice carried the rasp of someone who'd looked death in the eye and told it to wait. How bad is it? Kaelin didn't turn. Bad. The execution created a power vacuum. Half the noble houses are choosing sides. The other half are waiting to see who survives before they commit. Smart. Lyra coughed, her hand pressed against bandaged ribs. And the army. Darius Vane's brother. Kaelin's voice was flat. Marcus. He survived our purge and spent the last 6 months gathering every wolf with a grudge against my rule. He's calling it a liberation force. Liberation? Lyra's laugh was bitter. From what? Your tyranny or your incompetence? Both, probably. Kaelin finally turned to face her. He has a point. I built an empire on fear and never bothered checking if the foundation was solid. It wasn't. You were the foundation. And when you left, everything I thought was secure turned out to be smoke. Lyra studied him with eyes that had always seen too much. So what now? You going to feel sorry for yourself, or are you going to fix it? I don't know how to fix this. The admission hung in the air between them, raw, honest, the kind of vulnerability Kaelin had spent his entire life avoiding. Lyra pushed herself upright despite the obvious pain. Her silver hair fell across her shoulders, tangled and unkempt. She looked nothing like the silent queen who'd stood 3 seats away from power. She looked like someone who'd walked through fire and decided the burn marks were worth keeping. You start. Her voice was steady. By admitting you don't have all the answers. By asking for help instead of demanding obedience. By treating your people like they have value beyond what they can do for you. Kaelin moved to her bedside, sat in the chair he'd occupied for 3 days straight. I don't know if I can be that person. Then learn. Lyra's hand found his. Or die trying. Those are your options now. Outside, another explosion rocked the eastern district, closer this time. Orin burst through the door, his face grim. Your Majesty, Marcus Vane's forces have breached the outer wall. They're moving through the lower city. We have maybe 2 hours before they reach the palace. How many? 3,000, maybe more. He's offering amnesty to any wolf who joins his cause. Some of our own guards are defecting. Kaelin's jaw tightened. He looked at Lyra. Her expression was unreadable. You need to evacuate, he said quietly. You're in no condition to fight. Orin can get you to the northern safe house. No. Lyra's voice was absolute. Lyra, I said no. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, gasped, steadied herself. I didn't take a blade for you so you could die alone defending a palace that represents everything wrong with your rule. You can barely stand. Then help me stand. Her eyes blazed. We end this together or not at all? Kaelin stared at her, at the woman who'd been invisible for 7 years and was now the only thing he could see clearly. He stood, offered his arm. She took it. Together they walked from the recovery room into a palace preparing for siege. The war room was chaos. Maps covered every surface. Messengers ran in and out with updates that grew progressively worse. Kaelin's remaining generals argued over defensive positions, while nobles who'd spent years enjoying his protection now questioned every strategic decision. Kaelin and Lyra entered together. The room fell silent. Lady Marin, one of the few nobles who'd remained neutral through the conspiracy, spoke first. "Your Majesty, with respect, we cannot hold the palace against 3,000 wolves. We should negotiate surrender terms while we still have leverage." "Surrender." Kaelin's voice was cold. "To a warlord who wants my head on a spike. Better one head than hundreds." Lord Corvin wrung his hands. "Marcus is offering clemency to anyone who wasn't directly involved in his brother's execution. We could accept defeat and hope he keeps his word." Lyra's voice cut through the room like a blade. "How did that work out for the southern territories when you negotiated with the Valin cartel?" The room shifted uncomfortably. Lyra moved to the central map despite the obvious pain each step cost her. She studied it with the focus of someone who'd spent years memorizing every weakness in this empire's defenses. "The outer wall is breached here." Her finger traced the eastern approach. "He'll push through the lower city and hit the palace from 3 directions. Standard siege tactics, overwhelming force, minimal finesse." Orin nodded. "That's our assessment as well, so we don't let him reach the palace." Lyra's finger moved to a different section of the map. "The old aqueduct system runs beneath the eastern district. Collapse it here and here. You funnel his forces into a kill box at the market square. That would trap civilians." General Thrace's voice was uncertain. "No." Lyra pointed to secondary routes. "You evacuate them through these passages first. Give them 2 hours head start. Then you turn Marcus's numbers against him. 3,000 wolves in a confined space become a liability, not an advantage." The room was silent. Kaelin studied the map, studied Lyra, saw the tactical genius he'd ignored for 7 years now operating at full capacity despite being half dead from a knife wound. "It could work," he said quietly, "but it requires perfect timing, and we'd be gambling civilian lives on our ability to evacuate fast enough. We're gambling civilian lives either way." Lyra met his eyes. "At least this gives us a chance to control the outcome." Kaelin looked around the room, at generals who'd followed him without question, at nobles who'd enjoyed power without responsibility, at Orin, who'd served him faithfully even when he didn't deserve it. Then he looked at Lyra, at the woman who'd held this empire together while he played at being king. "We do it her way." His voice carried absolute authority. "General Thrace, coordinate the civilian evacuation. Orin, collapse the aqueducts on my signal. The rest of you, prepare for close-quarters combat. We end this today." The room exploded into motion. Lyra swayed slightly. Kaelin caught her elbow. "You should rest," he said quietly. "I'll rest when I'm dead." Her smile was grim. "Which might be soon, but at least I'll go out on my feet." The evacuation took 90 minutes. Families streamed through underground passages that most of the city had forgotten existed. Lyra coordinated the operation from a command post near the palace, her voice hoarse but unwavering as she directed traffic flow and resolved bottlenecks. Kaelin watched her work and understood something fundamental about leadership. It wasn't about being the strongest or the most feared. It was about seeing the people others overlooked and making sure they survived. Marcus Vane's forces hit the market square exactly when Lyra predicted. 3,000 wolves pouring into a space designed for maybe 500. The aqueducts collapsed with a sound like the earth breaking. Water flooded the lower levels. Exits sealed. The kill box became a reality. Kaelin stood on the palace ramparts, watching his empire tear itself apart, and felt the weight of every decision that had led to this moment. He'd built power through fear and control. He'd surrounded himself with people who told him what he wanted to hear instead of what he needed to know. He'd treated loyalty like a commodity and wondered why it crumbled when tested. And he'd stood beside a woman who could have saved him from all of it if he'd just been humble enough to listen. Marcus Vane's voice echoed across the trapped forces. "Draven, I know you're watching. Face me. End this like an alpha instead of hiding behind stone and strategy. It was a challenge as old as pack law. Single combat. Winner takes the empire." Kaelin turned to find Lyra standing behind him. She'd moved so quietly he hadn't heard her approach. Don't. Her voice was firm. It's a trap. He wants you emotional, reckless. I know. Kalen's hand rested on his blade. But he's right. This ends with me. Then it ends with both of us. Lyra drew her own weapon despite the way her ribs screamed protest. You don't get to die without me anymore. Kalen looked at her, at the fierce determination burning in her eyes, at the way she stood despite pain that would have felled lesser wolves, and he made a choice that had nothing to do with pride or power. Actually, his voice was quiet. I think it's time I stopped deciding everything alone. He turned to Orin. Open the gates. Let Marcus and his commanders through. We negotiate. Your Majesty. Orin started. That's an order. The gates opened. Marcus Vane strode through with 20 of his best warriors. He was built like a mountain, all muscle and barely contained rage. His eyes found Kalen immediately. Finally showing your face, Draven. Kalen descended from the ramparts, stopped 10 feet from Marcus. Close enough to talk, close enough to kill. You want the Empire, Kalen's voice carried across the courtyard. Take it. It's yours. The words sent shockwaves through both sides. Marcus's eyes narrowed. What game is this? No game. Kalen's hands were open. Empty. You're right. I built this empire on blood and fear. I ignored the wolves who needed protection and elevated the ones who fed my ego. I let corruption fester because I was too arrogant to see it. You want justice for your brother. I understand that. So here's your justice. Take the throne. Rule better than I did. Just let these people live. Silence. Marcus stared at him like he'd grown a second head. Then Lyra stepped forward. Her movement was painful, but deliberate. She positioned herself beside Kalen. Not shoulder to shoulder. Equal. He's not lying. Her voice cut through the tension. The old empire is dead. What you're fighting for doesn't exist anymore. But if you want to build something better, we'll help. No tricks, no conditions. Just a chance to stop bleeding and start building. Marcus's jaw worked. You expect me to believe the Alpha King who executed my brother in public is just going to walk away? Kalen met his eyes. I'm not walking away. I'm choosing differently. There's a difference. The courtyard held its breath. Marcus looked between them. At Kalen, who'd been the most feared ruler in the Empire. At Lyra, who'd been invisible until she wasn't. What are you offering? A council. Lyra's voice was steady. Representatives from every territory, every clan. Wolves who actually understand what their people need instead of what we think they should want. Real power distributed instead of hoarded. And you. Marcus's eyes fixed on Kalen. Where do you fit in this fantasy? Wherever I'm needed. Kalen's voice was quiet. And nowhere I'm not. I've spent 10 years demanding obedience. Maybe it's time I learn to earn trust instead. The silence stretched. Then Marcus did something unexpected. He laughed. It was a harsh sound, bitter, but genuine. You're either the smartest man I've ever met or the biggest fool. He shook his head. My brother died because you were too blind to see the rot in your own court, and now you want me to help you build something better. Yes. Marcus studied him for a long moment, then looked at his warriors, at the wolves trapped in the market square, at the empire burning around them. One chance. His voice was granite. You betray this, I'll finish what I started today. Agreed. Marcus extended his hand. Kalen took it. The courtyard erupted into chaos. Not violence, confusion, relief. The kind of bewildered hope that came from expecting death and finding possibility instead. Orin appeared at Kalen's shoulder. Your Majesty, what are your orders? Release the trapped wolves, medical care for the wounded, food and shelter for Marcus's forces. Kalen paused. And start organizing a council assembly. Every territory gets a voice. You're serious about this. Kalen glanced at Lyra. She was leaning heavily on her blade now, exhaustion and pain finally catching up. I'm serious about not dying the king who destroyed everything worth protecting. The reconstruction took months. The old throne room was dismantled. The throne itself melted down and reforged into something else. Something that didn't tower over everyone who approached it. The council formed slowly. Representatives arrived from territories that had never been asked their opinion on anything. Arguments erupted. Compromises were hammered out. It was messy and frustrating and nothing like the absolute control Kalen had once wielded. It was better. Lyra recovered gradually. The knife wound healed into a scar she wore without shame. She worked alongside Marcus and the other council members, her tactical mind helping navigate the chaos of building governance from scratch. Kaelin learned to listen. It was harder than any battle he'd ever fought. Every instinct screamed to take command, to issue orders, to solve problems through force instead of collaboration. But he'd spent 10 years ruling through fear and watching everything crumble, so he learned. 6 months after the siege, Kaelin stood in what used to be the throne room and was now a circular council chamber. Representatives from 12 territories sat in a ring. No hierarchy, no elevation, equal. The session had run long. Debates over trade routes and resource allocation, arguments about territorial disputes, the kind of tedious governance work Kaelin had always delegated to others. Now he sat through every minute of it. When the session finally ended, the representatives filed out. Lyra remained, reviewing notes. Kaelin walked to her side. "You're still here. Someone has to make sure you don't fall back into old habits." She didn't look up from her papers. "You tried to override Lord Brennan's replacement 3 times today. Marcus was wrong about the tariff structure. Maybe. But it's his territory, his decision. You don't get to be right for everyone anymore." Kaelin sat beside her. "I hate this." "I know." Lyra finally looked at him. "But you're getting better at it. The words shouldn't have meant so much. They did. Walk with me." Kaelin stood, offered his hand. Lyra took it. They walked through the palace gardens as twilight painted the sky purple and gold. The city beyond the walls was still scarred, still healing, but rebuilding. "We never talked about it," Kaelin said quietly, "about what happens with us." Lyra was silent for a long moment. "What do you want to happen?" "I want." Kaelin stopped walking, turned to face her. "I want to spend the rest of my life proving I can be someone worthy of standing beside you. Not because I'm king, not because of power or position, but because I finally understand what matters. And what matters? You." Kaelin's voice was raw. "Building something better than what we inherited, making sure no one else has to be invisible while holding an empire together, learning to value the people who were always there instead of the ones who told me what I wanted to hear." Lyra's expression was unreadable. "That's a nice speech." "It's the truth." She stepped closer. Her hand found his chest, right over his heart. "I spent 7 years loving you and being ignored. Another 6 months putting myself back together after leaving. I took a knife meant for you and almost died." Her voice was steady. "I'm not going to stand in your shadow again, Kaelin. Not for you, not for anyone. I don't want you in my shadow." Kaelin's hand covered hers. "I want you beside me. Equal. In everything. Equal." Lyra tested the word. "You understand what that means. Real power sharing, real partnership. No more making decisions without me. No more dismissing my voice when it's inconvenient." "Yes." "No more treating me like decoration or an asset or anything other than the person who sees you clearly and chooses to stay anyway." "Yes." Lyra searched his eyes, looking for the lie, the crack, the moment he'd revert to the man who'd ignored her for 7 years. She didn't find it. What she found instead was someone who'd been broken down to foundations and was slowly rebuilding into something different, something better. "One chance." Her voice echoed Marcus's words from months ago. "You revert to the old Kaelin. I don't just leave. I dismantle everything we built and make sure you remember why you needed me." "Understood." Lyra's lips curved into a smile that held both challenge and promise. "Then kiss me before I change my mind." Kaelin did. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't soft. It was 7 years of longing and 6 months of rebuilding and the fierce acknowledgement that they'd both survived things that should have destroyed them. When they finally broke apart, Lyra's forehead rested against his. "We're going to fight," she said quietly. "A lot. Because I'm not the Silent Queen anymore, and you're still learning not to be a tyrant." "I know. We're going to make mistakes, build things wrong, have to tear them down and start over. I know. And there will be days you wish you'd just kept the throne and ruled through fear because this is so much harder." Kaelin's hand cupped her face. "I know. But I'd rather spend the rest of my life failing at building something real with you than succeed at ruling an empire alone." Lyra's eyes shone. "Good answer." They stood in the garden as stars emerged overhead. Around them, the city continued its slow transformation. From empire to alliance, from control to collaboration, from the rule of one to the voice of many. It wasn't perfect, It was better than what came before. And in the space between who they'd been and who they were becoming, Kaelin finally understood what Lyra had known all along. True strength wasn't about never breaking. It was about what you built from the pieces afterward. It was about admitting when you were wrong and choosing to do better. It was about seeing the people beside you and valuing them not for what they could do for you, but for who they were when no one was watching. Power without purpose was just tyranny wearing a crown. But purpose partnered with someone who saw your blind spots and loved you anyway. That was worth fighting for, worth changing for, worth everything. 1 year later, the United Moon Territories held its first anniversary council assembly. Representatives from 18 territories now. The chamber had been expanded twice. Debates still ran long and heated. Compromises were still hard won, but they worked. Kaelin stood at the edge of the chamber, watching the proceedings. He no longer presided. His voice carried weight, but not ultimate authority. It felt right. Lyra stood beside him, not 3 seats away, not hidden in shadows. Beside him as an equal partner in governance that didn't belong to either of them anymore. It belonged to everyone. Marcus Vane approached, his expression thoughtful. The Eastern Territories are proposing an education initiative. They want your input. They have it. Kaelin gestured to the proposal. Lyra and I reviewed it last week. It's solid. They should implement it. Marcus studied him. A year ago, you would have demanded final approval. A year ago, I was an idiot. Kaelin's smile was wry. I'm still learning not to be. We all are. Marcus clapped him on the shoulder and moved on. Lyra leaned into Kaelin's side. Her hand found his. Tired? She asked. Exhausted. But Kaelin's voice held something that hadn't been there before. Something that sounded dangerously like contentment. Also grateful. For what? For you. For this. Kaelin gestured to the chamber. For the fact that I'm standing here watching an empire I almost destroyed become something better than I ever imagined. Lyra was quiet for a moment. Then, you know what the difference is between the old empire and this? What? The old empire existed because you demanded it. This exists because people choose it. Her eyes found his. That's what you never understood. Real loyalty can't be commanded. It has to be earned, every single day. Kaelin pulled her closer. I'm a slow learner, but I have a good teacher, the best. Lyra's smile was fierce and proud, and utterly unrepentant. They stood together as the council session continued, as voices rose in debate and fell in compromise, as the territories that had once bled under tyranny slowly learned to thrive under collaboration. The woman who had vanished from an empire that never saw her had become the reason a stronger kingdom was finally born. And the king who had ruled through fear finally learned that the only power worth having was the kind freely given by people who believed in what you were building together. The Crescent Moon Empire was dead. The United Moon Territories lived, and in the space between what was lost and what was gained, 2 wolves who had spent years missing each other while standing in the same room finally found what they'd been searching for all along. Not power, not control. Just partnership with someone who saw you clearly and chose to stay anyway. That was worth more than any throne.